Hello, hello, and welcome back to 2021. I, for one, would have obviously preferred if we had more in-person meetings for these meetups, but this does give us a great chance to, excuse me, I have the YouTube channel open and I'm hearing myself talk in my own ear. I do apologize for that. But this does give us a great chance to bring in wonderful speakers who would otherwise be unable to come to the Northern Virginia area. And we have a lot of, in addition to tonight, we have a lot of other wonderful speakers who will be joining us in meetups. So be sure to listen for our messages that we send out through Meetup or through Twitter. And please continue joining these meetups through 2021. So let's kick off the new year with Dr. Philip de Rijk.
All right. Thank you for the kind introduction. And hopefully, one of the good things about doing it online is not only speakers from across the world, but also attendees from all over the world. That would be even more awesome. So, the kind North Virginia OWASP chapter invited me to speak here today. I gave them a couple of options, and they settled on serving the right recipe for API authentication. So, essentially, we're going to talk about API authentication. I'm going to throw some cooking references in there just because we can. And hopefully by the end, or not hopefully, by the end, I will give you a bunch or an overview of different API authentication mechanisms and my recommendations of what to use when or where. Before we dive in, though, a couple of basic points I want to make clear so that we actually know what we're talking about, that we're on the same page. So we're going to talk about API authentication. And authentication is a process, well, there's all kinds of definitions, but in essence, it's a process where some party is providing proof that they are who they claim to be. So my typical example, especially in person, in real life, is everybody can claim to be me, but unless you're really good at answering web security questions or you have my passport, people might not believe that that is indeed true. So you'll have to prove that one way or another. That's authentication. That's proving to be who you claim to be. And we really want to do authentication not because we like it. It's mainly a means to an end, I would say, to perform authorization. And that's essentially what is the crux, the crucial property in all kinds of applications, including web applications. That's making authorization decisions, deciding if somebody is allowed to perform a specific operation with a specific piece of data. And of course, part of that equation is figuring out who exactly is making the request, hence the need for authentication. Without authorization, authentication would pretty much go away, and everybody's lives would probably be a lot easier as well. But hey, here we are, so we might as well talk about authentication for about 45 to 60 minutes. We're going to talk about client authentication to an API. Client is pretty vague. I'm going to stay pretty vague about that definition. I just want to say clients can be kind of anything. It's essentially whatever accesses an API. It can be a mobile app, a script you're running, accessing Git repos, I'm just saying something, or a front-end web application, back-end web application. There's all kinds of clients. On the API side of things, typically don't look that clean. You typically have a bit more APIs present there as well. And in modern systems, we're going to have inter-API communication as well. Interestingly enough, when one API calls another API, the caller API of the callee becomes essentially the client. So even between two APIs, two services, two backend systems, you have a client and server or API relationship. And that's often a confusing concept, but that's something that we need to be absolutely clear about right here. All right. When we're talking about API authentication, it's a bit of a different story, or a difficult story, because there's two concepts in play here. On one hand, we have client authentication. We want to know who the client is making that specific call to an API. But in a lot of cases, we don't really care who the client is. We more often care about on whose behalf the client is acting. So for example, if my mobile Twitter app contacts the Twitter API, I'm not sure that Twitter cares whether it's the actual Twitter application. They're mainly going to care whose account this Twitter app is acting on behalf of. So it's going to be for my Twitter account. So essentially, they can make authorization decisions about me and not necessarily about the client. This is not always true. This is sometimes you want to do both. Sometimes you don't care about the user, you care about the client only. So we're going to talk about a couple of different flavors throughout this session right here. Of course, service-to-service communication also relies on client authentication as well. All right. The talk is titled Serving the Right Recipe for API Authentication. So I needed some food references in here as well, which I actually like because I'm a chef. So we're going to talk about the New York pizza slice, which is essentially, it's not great. It doesn't look that wonderful, but it's delicious food. It's honest food, and it's something that we like. And we have the same kind of mechanisms in API authentication. There's things that are not that great, not sexy and awesome, but in essence, they feed you and they are pretty awesome. You'll have the golden option, the fancy restaurant. Back when I used to be able to travel, that was a whole different world. There's a great restaurant in Barcelona where you almost cannot get in. You have to book 3 months in advance, but they have absolutely delicious food. But that's something, that's the holy grail of API authentication, I would say. That's something you want to work towards, but it's going to be fairly challenging to get there if you're not that experienced with securing your APIs. And then you have, I don't know what to call this. Reddit is a great source for these things, by the way. Let's just say the things you want to forget as quickly as possible. Things you may have built or implemented yourself, but are essentially things you might want to get rid of in the near future. And I would definitely recommend to get rid of this thing, whatever it is. So yeah, that's where we're at. All right. Since we're going to talk about recipes, if you've ever looked up a recipe online, you know what's coming. There's going to be a whole life story about me first before we talk about anything useful. So let me get into that right away. In contrast to recipe websites, I'll keep it brief here. So I'm Philippe Dreyck. I'm from Belgium. I used to travel to the US quite a bit for work because I help companies build better and more secure web applications. I do that through training, a lot of developer-oriented training, security training, online courses more recently, and I also do consulting on specific problems. There's a lot of pictures there. I run my own company called Pragmatic Web Security, so there's a website with that, and I'm a Google Developer Expert and an Auth0 Ambassador, which are recognitions from those companies for the work I've been doing in public about security. All right, that's enough about me. Let's dive into the first topic. I have 3 topics right here I want to talk about, and the first one is basic client authentication. Let's say it's somewhere between the crappy lamb and the New York pizza of API authentication, if that ever makes sense. So, what's the most basic mechanism that we can implement? Well, it's based on a shared secret. So the client can send a request to the API, and the client can include a shared secret. And when the client does that, the API, who also knows that secret, can verify if that secret is indeed a secret. And if it is a secret, the API can send a proper response in return. This is as simple as it gets for client authentication. How can we implement this in practice? Because a secret is very vague. It doesn't tell you much, like, oh yeah, it's a secret. Well, one example is basic auth. Basic auth is this very old HTTP authentication mechanism, and everybody hates it. Basically, what it comes down to is that you include an authorization header in a request, you add type basic, as you can see on line number 3, and you add a seemingly random string to that header as well. This seemingly random string is base64 encoded, which means that you cannot read it, or most people cannot read it, but a computer has no problem reading that. And this is basically a username : password in base64. Is this secure? Well, I don't know. Somewhat, yeah, sure. This is authentication. This is as secure, I would say, as, well, even more secure as user authentication with a password, with a username and a password. It's basically 2 parties have a secret and one party proves like, hey, I have the secret, so that the API can verify this. While this seems like outdated and antiquated, this is still actively used today. For example, in the OAUTH framework, there is a mechanism of client authentication that just relies on basic auth with a client ID and a client secret. All right, so how else can we implement that? Well, maybe a bit more common way of implementing that is with API keys. So what we often use is an API key, which is a fancy word for saying password, because it's basically an API password. So in this example, we're not sending a username, but we're sending a secret key from the client to the API. And often that key acts as an identifier as well. So every client has their own API key, sometimes even linked to a user, but that's a different story. But every client has an API key. So when this secret is presented, the API assumes it's the legitimate client and can use that to authenticate the client. It's not really authentication, but you kind of get the idea. Well, no, it is authentication if you do this right. All right, brings us to the first recipe. So it doesn't really look like a recipe, but you kind of get the idea. So sending a shared secret can be implemented with basic authentication, API keys. It works well between services, so it's not bad, but it has some drawbacks. So what I want to do on these slides is give you an overview of some benefits and some drawbacks. So the benefits on the left, it's lightweight with minimal overhead. So API keys especially work really well if you have two internal services, they need to communicate and you're a bit in a jam and you need to implement authentication quickly, then API keys are not that bad. If it's a publicly exposed system, I would be a bit more worried about that. But for internal systems, this kind of works as a temporary or low maintenance and low value authentication mechanism. Let's say you have a system running somewhere and you don't want everybody calling that system, just a few services, then a simple API key may work. However, once you cross trust zones, once you go out your own trusted environment and with third parties and stuff like that, with actual clients outside of your own environment, then API keys are probably not going to work very well. All right. So API keys or shared secrets, pretty cool. What are the drawbacks? Well, these are actually kind of significant. Drawbacks, a secret, in this case a shared secret, has to be known by all involved parties. And there's this saying about normal people secrets that if you have a secret and the 3 people know the secret, the only way it stays a secret is if you kill 2 of the 3 people. In the API world, that's a bit more difficult, which is probably a good thing. Let's keep it like that. But essentially, every party involved here has to know the secret. You can imagine if you have a dozen clients and a dozen APIs that these pairwise couplings become insane. There's no way you'll generate a secret for every pair that can communicate. So you'll start sharing keys and sooner rather than later, you lose all control over your authentication scheme. So this is pretty challenging if you want to do this at a scale, and it's definitely not recommended. And a third drawback, also pretty significant, the secret here is not linked to the request in any way. Which means if somebody gets a hold of a secret, they can send any request they want with that same secret. Or virtually every request, depends on the authorization rules, but there's no limitations on what the attacker can try because the secret is independent of the type of request. These drawbacks, like I said, are pretty significant. So what we're going to do in the next steps is we're going to step by step chip away at these drawbacks and try to fix things into a better solution. All right, the first thing I want to tackle is linking the secret to the request, because this is we see the same with usernames and passwords. It's a nightmare to manage these things. So what if we can make that secret less powerful? What if we can tie it to the request in somehow so that it's only valid for this specific request? Well, we can do that by using a cryptographic HMAC function. So if you add crypto on top, people often like that. It's like, it has crypto, it must be secure. Well, it depends on what you do with that crypto. But in this case, we're going to use an HMAC. The HMAC, I'm going to show that in the next slide. The HMAC is calculated based on the request with the secret, and then you can send that HMAC to the API. And the API can verify whether that HMAC is valid or not and make its authorization decision and send you a response. How can we implement that in practice? Well, you could implement a custom mechanism called with a custom header, xrec_sig from request signature, and you throw in the HMAC in that header, and the API has to figure out how you calculated that because it has to do the same calculation. I'm going to show you other implementation schemes in a second. First, I want to step aside a bit with a small intermezzo about HMACs. How do HMACs work? What do they bring to the table? Well, in our scenario, we're going to use an HMAC function. In this case, it's HMAC SHA-256. It's an HMAC function based on SHA-256 hashing. it's implemented in a library, so you don't really need to worry about that. Just use something like that and you're good to go. What do we feed as input? Well, the request. Request data is input to the HMAC along with a secret known by the client. So that is input, two inputs, the data and the secret, and the HMAC function does its magic and it spits out an actual HMAC, which is basically a hash combined with the data and the secret in a specific way. Depends on the function on how that's done under the hood, but we don't care about the crypto details. We care about the implementation details as developers. All right. What happens next? Well, that HMAC is added to the data and the secret, to the data, sorry. So in this case, added to the request and sent to the API. How can the API figure out whether this is a valid request and who it's coming from? Well, the API is going to recalculate the HMAC in exactly the same way as the client did. And that function used by the API is going to spit out a value, and then the API will have to compare the value it just calculated to the value that was sent by the client. If these values are the same, it's a string comparison. We can probably manage that. Well, it's a bit more difficult in JavaScript, but if you use the triple equals, then we're all good in JavaScript as well. If this is the same, then we basically know that the data that we gave as input to the HMAC is the same as the client gave, and that the secret that we fed into the HMAC function is also the same. So if we assume that the client can keep its secrets really a secret, then we now have authenticated this request. We have a proof, or we have associated the request with a client, which is what we consider authentication in this case. Again, whether that's the exact definition, I'm going to leave that in the middle, but that's how we do this in software. If we end up in the red part, which means that the HMACs are different, then either you wrote crappy code, which is in my case always a possibility, or the data is different or the secret is different. If the secret is different, then it's not the client that we thought it was, so that's something we probably don't want to accept. If the data is different, then somebody messed or tampered with the data, and we also don't want to accept it. So we don't really care what's different. If it's red, it goes away. That's essentially what this slide means. And if it's green, then we know who sent it and we can make our authorization decision. So how do we implement that? Well, custom request headers are always very, very nice and awesome. Like, yeah, let's add our own thing. But in the end, it's probably a mistake because you're going to forget a couple of things and you'll be in trouble down the line. So in this case, I would recommend to look at a spec called HTTP signatures. And I'm going to talk about one example. And Amazon took that spec basically, or they implemented their own custom scheme. But if you're running things on AWS, chances are you've already used this HMAC-based authentication mechanism when you call AWS internal services, such as IAM. What's happening here? Well, when you send a request, you have to add, or the SDKs from Amazon, they add an authorization header with a type, in this case, AWS 4. That's request or signature version 4. It's an HMAC generated with SHA-256, and they identify the secret that was used for this. This is not the exact secret. It's just an identifier so that Amazon can look up the exact secret to make sure that this HMAC is valid. They also specify what headers they signed, in which order as well, because that matters to ensure the correctness of the HMAC, so the content type, the host, and some custom headers. And then you have the actual HMAC on line number 6. That's one very concrete way of implementing this exact scheme used in practice by Amazon. You might want to do this another way, and when you say HMACs today, a lot of people think about JSON Web Tokens. And to be honest, we can use JSON Web Tokens for custom authentication mechanisms based on HMACs like this. So what would we do there? We would generate a JSON Web Token and sign that with an HMAC, or add an HMAC signature and then send that token to the API, which can again verify that, and so on and so on. So essentially the concept doesn't change, just the implementation details might change depending on how you want to do things. What does that look like? Well, in this case, we still have a custom request header. We just throw the JWT in there instead of a raw HMAC. And the JWT can contain claims about the request. So the JWT is basically a JSON data structure. Let me step aside and show that in a second. It's a JSON data structure consisting of 3 parts: a header, a payload, and a signature. the red, purple, and blue parts. It's base64 encoded. It has a set of claims, in this case, a set of user-specific claims, but these could just as well be request-specific claims. So by adding our claims about a request, like what we're trying to do, for example, the headers maybe that we are using in that JWT, we can basically add an HMAC to a request using a JSON Web Token. All right, recipe card. So we can add an HMAC in the request. Note that we are still using shared secrets, so we still have the same secret both on the client and the API, but we're not sending that secret over the wire anymore. Instead of the secret, we're adding a request signature, an HMAC. Well, it's not really a signature, an HMAC about the request to the request, and that is linked to this specific request. And this means that one of the benefits now is that this signature, the HMAC, is tied to this specific request. So as an attacker, if I steal that HMAC one way or another, something bad happens, and all of a sudden I have an HMAC, that's only valid for this specific request. And that may not be very useful for me because, sure, I can try a replay attack, but that's about it. I cannot send another request with that same HMAC because that will not be accepted if enough request properties are part of that HMAC signature. It's still relatively easy to implement. Let's face it, there's no complicated key management going on here. It's just a HMAC secret, which is often just a string that is stored in a key vault or a key secret management system. That's essentially all that it takes to make this work. All right. Drawbacks? Well, the secret is still known by all involved parties. Again, scalability becomes an issue here. If you want to do this with a dozen clients and a dozen APIs, it's not going to be pretty, it's not going to work well, and you'll have a lot of secrets, which in some cases actually cost you explicit money because you'll have to pay per secret in some secret management services. So this might not be the best approach. Usually when you implement something like this, it's application level code to verify the HMACs, which is again a point of vulnerabilities, which is something you might want to consider avoiding. And that brings us to the first, or to the conclusion of the first topic. That was shared secret-based API client authentication. Yeah, basically client authentication based on shared secrets. Don't worry if you are still unclear what to use when. I have that overview coming up at the end of the presentation, which is essentially my way of telling you to stick around until the end and don't run off sooner. I've understood that it's snowing in the US anyway, so it's not like you can go out and stuff like that. So just stay inside, hopefully warm, and you can enjoy API authentication. All right, so what can we do better? How can we improve on this? And improving on this typically means using public and private keys. In this case, a client is going to get a private key, which is supposed to be private, and the server, the API in this case, has the client's public key, which is supposed to be public, and you can take that quite literally. You can actually publish that public key in a public location. You can paint it on the front of your house if you have geeky neighbors. They're going to appreciate that, or you can put it on a key server somewhere, public information. It doesn't matter who has that. How is this going to work? Well, the client is going to generate a signature on the request using the private key and send that request with a signature to the API. Just like before, actually. But the difference is there's no shared secret, there's a public key. So the API is now going to take that public key of the client and verify that signature. So the API doesn't need any sensitive information to authenticate the client. It can just use public information that it can easily obtain one way or another. And the API can again make its authorization decision like, hey, this client is sending me this request. Do I want that, yes or no? And based on that, the API can do what needs to be done. This signature here acts as a proof of possession mechanism. It's a stronger, I would say, than HMACs or shared secrets, which are also proving possession of a secret. But since it's a shared secret, it's not really a secret. This private key is really, really private. And only this particular client instance is supposed to have that private key. So this is actually a private secret, and having possession of that corresponds to authentication in these schemes. All right, so how does that work in practice? Well, let's look at a flowchart, very much like we did with HMACs, to figure out the details here. The client is going to use a cryptographic signing function. I've put down RSA here simply because it's the most or the best well-known or the most well-known algorithm for these kind of signatures. There are some better choices today. So take a minute if you want to implement something like this by yourself. Take a minute to analyze the best cryptographic option for that function, depending on your preferences, your requirements, your compliance requirements, library support, and so on and so on. If you're still on .NET 3.5 something, then your choices are not going to be that great. All right. What do we feed as input? Well, the request data, just like before, and the private key also goes in that signing function, and out comes the signature. Again, random gibberish, well, there is some kind of logic behind it, but it's not supposed to be meaningful except for when you want to verify that signature. And essentially that signature is what we attach to the request to authenticate that request to prove that it's coming from a legitimate client. And we send that to the server. The API running on the server can verify the signature. In this case, there is typically a verification function, so a single function that takes three inputs. It takes the request data, or the data that is supposed to be signed. It takes the signature as input, and it takes a public key as input. And with that information, it can make a decision. This public key is uniquely linked to a private key. So the private and the public key here are mathematically linked to each other. And please don't ask me how, because I have no idea how that works. Fancy maths, all of a sudden you have a key pair that's linked to each other. So if the verification function says green, which is all good, Boolean true, no exception, whatever your language prefers to do, that means that the data has not changed because the signature over that data is valid. So the integrity of the data is proven. And it also proves that the signature has been generated with the private key that belongs to this particular public key. So if you're verifying the signature with public key from client A and it checks out, then you know that this request has been sent by client A, or client A has a massive security problem since they lost their private key. But 9 times out of 10, I would say it's going to be a request coming from client A. If it doesn't match, anything could have happened. Either the signature is corrupt, the data has been modified without authorization, or you're using the wrong key, and again, we don't really care. If it's red, it goes away. Kick it out. This is not a validly signed request, and this should not be handled by the application in any way. Just throw it out and try again next time. All right, so how do we implement that? Well, it depends on how much effort you want to do. So let's start with a very much effortful solution. So how can we implement that with doing a lot of effort? Well, we can use something called HTTP signatures. This is the same spec that Amazon used to base its HMAC mechanism on. They also have a digital signature option, and you can see the similarities to Amazon's mechanism. So what we do is we add a signature header in step 4 and 5, and that header contains a bunch of metadata about the signature. What does it include? Well, there's a key ID, which identifies which specific public key should be used. That's just a way to look it up in your key management solutions. We have an algorithm being used, also useful to double check whether that makes sense. It probably should be used from other places as well, but that's a different story. There's a timestamp and an expiration, which means that the signature has a limited lifetime. The headers that have been used to generate the signature on line 5, and then on at the end of line 5, the actual signature. And this essentially allows the API to verify that signature on the request, delivers integrity over the data and authenticity of the data as well. All right. What if you are not a fan of HTTP signatures because you're probably a JavaScript developer and you like JSON so much that you want to use JSON Web Tokens? Well, I have some good news for you. You can absolutely do that by using the digital signature option of JSON Web Tokens. So you can basically sign a JWT, and you should sign your JWTs with a private key and verify them with a public key. So the mechanism doesn't change. The implementation typically becomes a authorization header with the type bearer. That's the proper way of sending a token like this in an authorization header, and that the value of the bearer authorization header is basically the JSON Web Token. What you put in the JSON Web Token is up to you. If you want to implement this as a custom mechanism, you can add whatever the hell you want. I would recommend to add some properties about your request and use the HTTP signature spec as inspiration to figure out what you should add in this JSON Web Token. All right, sounds awesome, but nobody in their right mind would use that, right? I mean, what the hell are we doing with authenticating clients with JSON Web Tokens? Well, surprisingly, this is used in practice as well. There's a JWT profile for OAuth where you basically get a full description of how to implement client authentication with JSON Web Tokens. So if you are thinking about implementing something like that, I strongly recommend to also use a spec like this, especially the section security considerations, as inspiration, because it's going to contain useful pointers for you as well. So in OAuth, we can use this for certain authentication schemes. Why would you do that? Well, because JSON Web Tokens are really, really well supported in virtually every language you can find. So if you need this particular mechanism and you want to make sure you have an easy to use library, then this might be a good implementation choice. All right. So where are we at now?
Sorry to interrupt just 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
There is a question. I don't know if you want to answer it or if you want to wait till the end, or how do you want to handle that? It's about public.
I want to answer that right now. Absolutely.
Perfect. This is, so how does the client register its public key with the server?
No, we're not going to do that. So you're not allowed to ask me sneaky questions. So if I brush over details, just accept it and be blissfully ignorant. No, that's a really good question. Let me go one slide back, because this is actually really relevant. In an OAuth world, clients are pre-registered with the API. So essentially, not with the API. Okay, sorry, let me rephrase. In an OAuth world, a client would authenticate to an authorization server, and clients are pre-registered with the authorization server. So you typically configure an actual client, and there you can specify, hey, this client has this public key, or hey, the keys for this client are available in this location, and that's how you set up this trust relationship. The OAuth world also supports, or OpenID Connect supports, dynamic client registration, where a client can register itself along with its public keys. In this case, you would not necessarily get a strict authentication mechanism, but it's very comparable to a user sign-up feature, where the user the first time says like, hey, I am Philip, and I'm going to choose a super cool password called FluffyDog19. Awesome. And then maybe the other service has no idea who you really are, because everybody can claim to be you. And next time that user comes back, they say like, hey, I was Philip, and here's FluffyDog19. And the service is like, yeah, good enough for me. I assume you are the same person as before. So here is your data or whatever. And the same works with client authentication. So you'll need a way to set this up. Of course, if you want to make things more complicated, you could set up a whole key management system around this with a PKI, basically, where one party issues public and private keys, or issues certificates on public keys, and then the API can say like, everything that's approved by this PKI system is good enough for me. That would also be an option. But you're absolutely correct about that question. That's a very valid remark. That's something you have to set up separately from the client authentication itself. The next section is also going to be a bit more relevant about this as well. And if there's more questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. I'm sure Ben will do some filtering and keep the silly questions to the end. But the relevant questions, they can definitely be asked during the presentation. I have no problem with that. All right, back to the recipe here. Asymmetric request signatures. It's called asymmetric because we have the private public key. It's not symmetric, it's not a shared secret, but it's a public private key based scheme. Absolutely awesome. This is getting close to the holy grail of API authentication. Benefits: no shared secrets. This is huge. This is absolutely amazing. We only need to share the public key, and we can give every client a private key. Makes it a lot more manageable, because essentially you can now create one key pair per client and then give everybody each other's public keys, and then you're done with generating keys. So no huge list of secrets anymore. You can store cryptographic keys securely in secret management systems, and so on and so on. Absolutely amazing. Drawbacks? Well, Key management and trustworthiness, as your colleague already pointed out in this very sneaky question, is definitely challenging. So there's no easy answers there. It's going to take some effort to set up this in a complicated system. It's going to take some effort to set this up correctly. This mechanism provides authenticity and some data integrity. So sure, there's no confidentiality. That's basically my point there. So everybody can still observe the data if they want to. And integrity protection only applies to the signed data, so everything that's not signed can still be tampered with. And these are not big drawbacks in my opinion, especially if you use HTTPS and stuff like that, but I just want to point them out because the next solution addresses all of these in one single go. And the next solution relies on more keys. In this case, we're going to use mutual TLS or MTLS. And when we use TLS, we typically use TLS in one direction. The client, your browser, often connects to an HTTPS website. And that's the reverse scenario there. The API or the website, the server is authenticating itself to your browser. And again, authentication is a big word here, but your browser is establishing a trust relationship with that server. It's trying to figure out if this is the legitimate pragmaticwebsecurity.com server, yes or no. Well, in that case, I wouldn't even know because it's hosted at Netlify, so they can do whatever they want with my website. That's, again, a different story. How does MTLS work? Well, it's basically the public-private key-based authentication mechanism just on both sides of the connection here. So the client has a private key and the API has the client's public key. And vice versa, the client has the API's public key and the API has the private key. And these typically have TLS certificates associated with them, and both parties will verify trust in that certificate. The client will verify whether it trusts the certificate served by the API, which is signed by Let's Encrypt. And most clients will be like, yeah, I know Let's Encrypt. I kind of trust them. So you know what? It's good enough for me. I'm going to accept this certificate as valid. And you should, because Let's Encrypt is actually awesome. On the API side of things, that mechanism is well, clients typically don't have publicly registered TLS certificates. So again, you probably want to use either self-signed certificates or a PKI-based solution, or if you want to, you can use publicly signed certificates as well. But you're kind of open there to do whatever you want to do, as long as the API has a way to verify trust in that certificate. And with that, you get not only authenticity, also integrity protection of the entire connection and confidentiality of the entire connection. You basically get the best parts of TLS and the best parts of client authentication all rolled into one single solution. And that brings me to another recipe card, using MTLS or mutual TLS. Essentially, it offers confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity. Absolutely big benefits. More, even better, it's supported in most languages and frameworks. Building a Java app, guess what? Your Java SSL library can handle MTLS. Building a Node.js application, guess what? It handles MTLS. This is actually a really, really powerful concept which has been around for ages, but just not used that often until recently, and it's actually very, very well supported. It even works with self-signed certificates as long as you can establish trust. If you're building two systems and you give each system a hard-coded certificate or a certificate fingerprint, guess what? You can use self-signed certificates and you don't even have to worry about getting real certificates for that matter. So, all benefits, no drawbacks. That seems weird. Well, there are some drawbacks. It works really well in clients where you control the code. In, I would say, let's say native clients. It works really well with native clients, but it doesn't work well with browser-based applications. So if you're building a single-page application and you want to use MTLS, well, unless you really hate your users, I recommend you not use MTLS because the user interface in browsers is absolutely horrible. If you do hate your users, well, sure, go ahead. Just don't tell them that I told you to do that. That's all good. Certificate management and key management is still challenging. You still have to find a way to create and manage these certificates and so on. And you typically don't get any other data besides what's in the certificate. So if you want to use custom information, custom claims, which you can easily do with, for example, a JSON Web Token, that's going to be really hard with MTLS-based authentication. So But still, it's the best mechanism we have available, and it's my absolute recommendation that if you can implement MTLS, go for that. And who does that in practice? Well, again, OAuth has also a MTLS-based authentication mechanism. So it's an RFC 8705, if you like reading that. It's essentially very similar to the JWT mechanism, where a client can authenticate by setting up an MTLS connection. This is used a lot in the OAuth world because people there are realizing that security is becoming more and more important, and this is kind of the holy grail. You want to go, at least in your backend systems, you want to go to MTLS communication and use that to enforce stricter mechanisms like sender constraint tokens and so on. If you're running things on AWS, you are pleased to know that since about half a year, the API gateway also supports MTLS authentication. This used to be based on API keys before that, but now you have a better mechanism called MTLS. Use it to your advantage. And if you're doing something like ISTIO, ISTIO has an automatic MTLS configuration option, which is absolutely awesome. So when you deploy, well, I'm not an expert here, so I have to be careful what I say, but when you deploy your services, there's a component called Citadel, which is going to generate certificates for each service and issue them, which kind of solves the key management problem for you. And then you can specify communication policies using these identities. So you can say, hey, service A can talk to service B, but service B is not allowed to talk to service A. And that policy is enforced using MTLS for client authentication, all by the framework or the service mesh itself. Absolutely awesome. All right. Where does that leave us? We haven't talked about users. And in the next hour and a half, I'm going to talk about passwords because everybody knows. I'm just joking here. I'm not going to talk about user authentication. I'm going to talk about propagating user authentication to an API on a very, very, very high level. I'm just going to show you three mechanisms, three ideas, so I can give you the pros and cons, but we don't have time to dive much deeper into these mechanisms. That would literally take me 2 or 3 hours.
Sorry, just before we dive into user authentication, we just have one last question.
All right.
Do you agree that MTLS provides zero trust security?
Whew, that's a good question. I would say that it's definitely going to help. Yeah, absolutely. If you deploy MTLS consistently across all your services, then you can basically consider the network to be fully untrusted. It's basically every connection will be fully authenticated, fully integrity protected, and fully confidential. So I would say that's a big part of that setup. Absolutely. All right. And with that, we can dive into user authentication. So user authentication is a whole different beast because so far we have authenticated every single request. On every request, we're like, hey, we're this client. Hey, we're this client. Look at this. Here's a signature. We're this client. But now that's going to change because as a user, seriously, you don't want to do that. I'm even annoyed if I have to log into my Twitter like once a week. It's like, what the hell is going on here? Why is this happening over and over again? So imagine this for every request. So what we're going to do is instead, the user is going to provide credentials to an application, and the application is going to authenticate to an authentication service, which is very fancy on a slide, but in practice, that's often, if it's a monolith, it's an endpoint, like, hey, we authenticate and we do something, or it's a separate service, but essentially, you kind of get the idea. There's multiple ways of implementing this. If the credentials are valid, in this scenario, the authentication service is going to give you a very tasty cookie to track that authentication state. And that cookie will be present on every request coming from the browser going to that specific domain. And in this case, the API can use that cookie for authenticating the user, authenticating between quotes, for establishing the user's identity from a trusted source, which is the authentication service, and using that to make authorization decisions. And I can hear you from here all the way in Belgium like, what the hell are you talking about? We don't use cookies with APIs. Are you nuts? Well, yes, I am. That's one thing. I can get that out of the way. But why won't we use cookies? Why wouldn't we use cookies? Cookies work really well if you configure them correctly, your cookie security is actually not that bad, and they have a couple of benefits. Of course, cookies only work well within a domain, so it doesn't work across different domains. It's going to be a freaking nightmare if you try to do that, especially in browsers like Brave and Safari, which are really cracking down on third-party cookies by blocking them all. But if you have a front end and an API running in the same domain, such as app.restockway.com, then honestly, cookies work really well. And if you're thinking about the old PHP session ID cookies, well, note that cookies can also be stateless in the sense that they can hold a session object which is fully pushed to the client. I don't think that's a good idea of handling cookies, but that's again a different story for a different time. So I put authentication between quotes here because honestly the user authenticates once and cookies just propagate that state. That's essentially the meaning of the quotes. What are the benefits? Well, the browser handles cookies automatically, which is a good thing. It can create an attack called cross-site request forgery, but modernly well-secured cookies are resistant to those attacks by the same site attribute. It's supported by most backend frameworks. Building a Express app, there's plenty of cookie libraries. Happy.js, plenty of cookie libraries. Java Spring supports cookies. PHP-based API frameworks support cookies, and so on and so on. And modern browsers have solid security measures for cookies. Seriously. I know it goes against all your gut instincts, like, no cookies. But sometimes cookies are the right choice. Trust me, I've worked with a lot of clients where cookies were the right choice. Drawbacks. Well, cookies only work well in browser-based apps. So if you're also using mobile applications, cookies are going to be a nightmare, just so you're warned. They only work well in a single domain. So it doesn't work well across domains. That's going to be painful. And the biggest drawback of all, if you suggest the use of cookies, people are going to look at you in a funny way and they're going to think you're really uncool and you're stuck in the 90s something. But hey, we got to take some of the hits when we want to build secure applications, right? All right. What do the cool kids do then? If cookies are uncool, well, the cool kids are building basically the same system, but instead of a cookie, they're using a JSON web token, of course. So instead of a cookie, they're issuing a token, typically a JWT, that they store in local storage, and whenever they contact the API, the cool kids are going to add an authorization header, type bearer, and throw the token in that header, allowing the API to make an authorization decision. I challenge you to look at this slide and the previous slide to find the 5 differences. I'm sure there are not even 5 on the actual slide. This is the exact same mechanism, especially if you use client-side cookie-based sessions. This mechanism is 100% the same. It's just the transport mechanism and the location of data storage in the browser that's different. But this is the same mechanism. It looks like this in practice. If you want to send that, request number 4 has that authorization header right there. Recipe. This is token-based authentication. Again, the user has authenticated once and we're propagating that state with a token. What does this bring us? Well, it works well for all types of clients, including JavaScript applications. So mobile app, front-end web app, doesn't matter. It just works, and that's actually pretty nice. Works well in a single application, like single front-end and API, sure, why not? And most importantly, it makes you really look cool. Like all the cool kids building single-page apps are doing token-based authentication, and they honestly don't realize what they're doing and what the consequences are. All right, what's the drawback? Well, the drawbacks here are that this requires a custom code to handle in the backend. And I just completed a talk on JSON Web Token security for the Belgian OWASP chapter earlier today. And essentially, we talked about all the ways you can mess that up in your application. And it's ridiculous how difficult it is to handle JSON Web Tokens correctly, especially if you're generating them yourself. The reason I really dislike this pattern is because you often see this as token-based authentication with long-lived tokens. It's like, oh, here's a username and a password. So like response, here's a token valid for a week. See you again in a week. And that token lives on the client and you have 0 control over that token. That's a really, really dangerous way of handling authentication because you have no revocation mechanism. You have no way to well, to stop an authenticated session, well, it's a session basically, to stop that from being used if such a token is compromised or stolen. And token security in browser-based apps is really, really hard. Cookie security is a bit better, but token security is a nightmare, trust me. So, is there a better alternative? Well, it would be kind of depressing if there wasn't. So yes, there is, but it's not the easiest alternative. And the alternative is basically OAuth and OpenID Connect in some way, but in this case, OAuth. And OAuth is a very complicated framework to run a flow between a client and an authorization server to obtain certain permissions from the user. I know, it's pretty complicated. What does it allow you to do? Well, the client can ask the user, hey man, I want to access this API to tweet on your behalf. Do you think that's cool? And the user can be like, oh yeah, of course, TweetTech application, you can do that. Awesome, thank you. The client gets a token, and with that token, it goes to Twitter and says like, hey man, post this on this user's timeline, and Twitter's gonna be like, yeah, sure, that looks good, I'm gonna do that. That's essentially OAuth in a nutshell. Probably the shortest explanation I've ever given for OAuth. Benefits, there's still user authentication, but the user authenticates to an authorization server, to one trusted location for a bunch of clients. So even that is better. There's no credentials exposed to actual client applications. Credentials remain between the user and the authorization server. We get an access token in response, and with that token we can contact the API. The contents of access tokens are very well defined. They're also open, but they're well defined. And there's all kinds of rules on how to handle them, all kinds of ready-to-use server libraries to handle access tokens, and so on and so on. So that's what OAuth does in practice. This is actually really, really awesome. In addition to that, that's not on the slide here, but OAuth also supports refresh tokens, allowing the client to obtain a fresh access token when the old one has expired. And that refresh token is controlled by the authorization server, so you kind of get a revocation mechanism. Make the access token's lifetime 5 minutes, and every 5 minutes the client will have to ask a new token, and the authorization server at any time can say like, yeah, no, you're done. You don't get any more tokens. The user has said that you are a bad client, so I'm going to kick you out, and you can do that, which you couldn't do with a JWT-based authentication. Quickly, what does that look like? Well, access tokens in OAuth most often are JSON Web Tokens, even though they don't have to. There's another mechanism as well. If you decode them, they look like this. There's a bunch of claims in there. And if you look at some of these specific claims, you'll see an SUB claim in an access token. That's the user's identifier, the subject of the token. So this tells the API exactly which user is making that call. There's typically an authorized party in there as well. That's a client identifier. This tells the API, oh, it's this particular client. It's a random ID, but this particular client is, or this token belongs to this particular client. This token is intended for this specific audience, so you can use it on these specific APIs, and it has an expiration time as well. So you can see that these tokens already contain a lot of claims to address a lot of common threats that you may not have in your tokens in your application if you build such a custom mechanism. So OAuth, if you're dealing with multiple clients, if you're dealing with multiple APIs and you need client access on behalf of users, the de facto standard today is the use of OAuth 2.0, and 2.1 is a consolidation of best practices coming soon. They're working on the draft. Benefits, it's a uniform framework for various clients, supports mobile apps, front-end web apps, which is a bit tricky, back-end web apps, and so on. Well-defined threat model, security considerations, all part of the spec. A very enormously large ecosystem of libraries, which make implementations really, really simple. Depending on what system you're building, but typically you can implement client-side support for OAuth in a couple of lines of code. It would surprise me if you need more than 12 lines of code. Drawbacks, it's a pretty complex system, especially in a simple architecture. So if you're building a simple application, then OAuth is going to be the biggest chunk you'll have to deal with, I would say. So it may not be suitable for all architectures, or it's definitely not suitable for all architectures. User authentication involves a browser, which is awesome for people using things like password managers and so on, but a nightmare for people building mobile apps because they're like, what? I don't want to use a browser. And sure, you can embed that browser, that system browser a bit, but it still breaks the flow a bit. And it's very complicated to get OAuth right. Well, if you want to know how complicated, so complicated, I actually built a full online course, a 3-part online course to understand OAuth and OpenID Connect. And people seem to need that to get started. At least that's the feedback that I get, that this course really helps them get started with OAuth or fully understand OAuth and OIDC. So if you want to get that, there's a discount code specifically for OWASP right here. So grab that and go learn about OAuth and OpenID Connect. If you're not too keen on that, then let's talk about API authentication for a couple more minutes.
Sorry, there is one question. So it's where do you want to store the access token on the client side?
That's a very imprecise question, because what is the client side? An OAuth client can be a mobile app, it can be a backend web application, it can be a script running in a terminal or a batch job, or it can be a front-end web application. So just to illustrate how complex OAuth is, I'm assuming you're talking about a client-side web app. Then honestly, you don't want to store the token anywhere, at least if it's a sensitive application, because it's really, really hard to secure tokens in JavaScript in the presence of malicious JavaScript. So my recommendation for sensitive apps in that case is the use of a backend for frontend, or a BFF, which basically keeps tokens in a server-side proxy component and just uses a traditional web session between the frontend and that server-side proxy. And that proxy translates from web sessions to access tokens when it forwards a call to an API and handles that for you. If you want to know more, there's this course from this dude in Belgium about OAuth and OpenID Connect that explains that in painstaking detail. Just saying. Of course, you can also harass me after the talk with more questions. That's also fine. All right, so the overview. What did we talk about? In case you missed some things, this is a good recap. Sending a shared secret is either API keys or basic auth or HMACs. Well, that's a simple mechanism. It only works well in a single trust zone. There's a specific use case for that. So, for example, internal services talking to each other, sure, you can do that with API keys, but I wouldn't build a large architecture based on API key authentication. Just saying. You can use it, but be aware that it's only valid in a single trust zone and that it has some limitations that you might want to address sooner rather than later. Asymmetric signatures are better. There's no shared secrets. That's awesome. I didn't recommend this specifically because I'm using colors later on, because MTLS is actually better. So MTLS is kind of the better version of asymmetric request signatures because it's well supported. It has full library support in almost every language. It has confidentiality built in and all of that. So honestly, that's my recommendation for service-to-service communication. If you're building service-to-service communication today, use MTLS to secure that communication. What else did we talk about? Well, we have cookie-based authentication. That's useful in a single web application architecture. Simple front-end, well, simple front-end, some APIs all running in the same domain, all belong to the same application. Cookies are probably going to work really well there. All right. That's when you want to authenticate public clients running on users' machines. There you typically care about the user, not about the client. Hence these cookie-based mechanisms. Token-based, I put that in red because I strongly don't recommend it unless you have a way to implement revocable refresh tokens or a revocable session. Essentially, if you can keep your tokens short-lived and you have a mechanism to get new ones where you can intervene when necessary, then this is acceptable. But most implementations have that not available, so I don't recommend that. If you want to go that direction, you probably need OAuth anyway, so look into using OAuth. It has, it's the de facto standard to support multiple clients, multiple APIs to handle user authentication in a centralized way, in a proper way, without having to do that in your applications. And that's what OAuth essentially brings to the table. All right. I have a couple of references here about techniques, mechanisms I talked about, so I recommend you check them out if you want to learn more. And as a final request, connect with me on Twitter and LinkedIn. First of all, so you can learn about security, and second of all, so I can inform you about useful resources. On Twitter, you'll find a link on my profile, a pinned link to, or a pinned tweet to cheat sheets, for example, security cheat sheets about a couple of these topics. So connect with me, you will not regret it. I usually post very interesting and useful stuff. And with that, I'll make myself available if Ben wants to relay some more questions. I don't know if there are any or not.
No, the chat looks pretty quiet. They're all just thanking you for your input and for your wonderful talk. So,
all right,
let's see.
That's awesome then.
Yep. Yeah, I don't see any additional questions, but you just posted your Twitter handle there, so I'm sure if they have any specific questions about the talk, they are more than free, more than happy to reach out to you.
All right, awesome.
But yeah, that's that. Thank you again for coming in and speaking here. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was a really awesome talk, Philippe. Thank you so much. And I love the way you walk through the diagrams. That dog with the white chocolate, that was disturbing. We don't need one of those again, but everything else was great.
I think it's a lamb, actually. I don't know. But,
is it?
I always assumed it was a lamb, but I don't know.
I'm not sure. It had like sort of Cocker Spaniel to me, but I probably didn't look at it close enough.
There you go. They're nightmares,
That's
Sean.
Stuff of nightmares. We actually have a tradition here, like when you do like a communion or something. There's an ice lamb, so it's like an ice cream cake, and you're supposed to cut off the head of the lamb, and they put like fake blood in it, so it's like horrifying for kids because they chop off the head and it's like starts bleeding strawberry juice or something. It's like what the hell is wrong with people?
Oh my gosh, disturbing and delicious at the same time.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, yeah. So there are no more questions, and I can close it down for today and let you get some rest.
All right.
But yeah,
awesome.
Thanks again for coming in.
Perfect. My pleasure, and I hope to see you soon, whether online or in real life. We'll see about that. But yeah.
Hopefully both. And thanks everybody for joining and participating in the chat.
Awesome. Bye-bye.